Shalom. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Scott with Beth Yeshua Messianic Synagogue in Fort Myers, Florida. We are reissuing the Revelation series that was taught by Rabbi Jim Pickens here at Beth Yeshua over the course of the last 2 years or so. We feel these messages are especially relevant in these tumultuous times, and we hope and pray that Adonai uses them to strengthen you and to encourage you. If you are currently a supporter of this ministry, we would like to say thank you. We appreciate your partnership with us as we all labor together in the work of the gospel of Yeshua in the kingdom here on earth. If you would like to support us, you will find a link below in the video description. Once again, we hope that this is a blessing to you. If you have any questions, you will find an email address. If you have any dialogue or discussion, you'll find an email address in the video description below. Please reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. And now I will give you the Revelation series with Rabbi Jim Pickens. Shalom.
All right, we're going to pick this up tonight in Zechariah chapter 13 and verse 4. And just a quick review, chapters 12, 13, and 14 are a unit that together are describing end-time events, the series of things that will take place as we get into the end of the age. The expression "in that day" or "on that day" is continually in use throughout these chapters. We're defining that day as the day of Adonai, which most likely begins somewhere just before the Great Tribulation sets in, extending through the tribulation. And there are some that think that this day of Adonai might also include the millennium period. I do not think so. I think the millennium is a totally different thing that this is just leading up to. Anyway, this is not a day that we would think of as a day, rather it's a period of time. It may be called the day of the Lord, but it's a period of time. It's an era, a particular era. And I think that time is going to be relatively short, but at least through the tribulation portion. However, time will tell. Time will tell. In chapter 12, we saw that the nations of the world will come against Jerusalem. Jerusalem is being used as a capital that speaks to all of Israel being involved. A great deal of military action is going to take place. There's going to be a great deal of strife in Israel itself. And sometime during this period of time, towards the end of this period of time, actually, Messiah returns, bringing this to an end. And they shall see him whom they have pierced was a very messianic statement that really is part of what is going on here with this. The him is that they have pierced is Yeshua, and they will see Yeshua whom they have pierced as he reappears at the end of this time frame. When this occurs, there's going to be a change in the hearts of some of the people of Israel, a third of them, as we'll see, and there will be a great mourning take place, because when they recognize whom they have pierced, they will realize that their forefathers and themselves have not recognized Messiah for who he really is. This lamentation to God, this turning to God, has a certain effect. And in Zechariah 13:1, which we looked at last week, it says that on that day a spring will be opened in the house of David for the people of Israel living in Jerusalem, to cleanse them from sin, from the sin and the impurity that they have come into possession of. Zechariah 13:2 speaks to unclean things. There's going to be false prophets, for instance, which is an unclean thing. There's going to be an unclean spirit expelled from the land. The spirit of uncleanness is a noun in the feminine and is used only here in the Old Testament. Just think about that. It's common in the New Testament, but it's found here only in the Old Testament, a spirit of uncleanliness or an unclean spirit. Even though it doesn't state it, it's in reference, I believe, this unclean spirit to the false Messiah. At the very least, could be as well of all things having to do with Satan. At that time in the land, there will have been idolatry going on. There's idolatry going on in Israel right now in great numbers. False prophets are in place, taking place. Zechariah 13:2 talks about the fact that these prophets lie. Just think about that. They lie in the name of Adonai. In the name of Adonai, these false prophets in Israel are spreading lies. These prophets are giving the lies of the adversary, if you will, in the name of Adonai. And there will be false religions available in the land to draw from at that time. They will be crying out in the land at that time, peace, peace, when there really is no peace, because they're still working towards creating man-made peace within the land. The backlash to these false prophets will be such as to cause their parents ultimately to kill them. The word stab that we looked at in Zechariah 13:5 is the same thrust through in the Hebrew that was used back in Zechariah 12:10, which we translated as pierced. There is an indication that the killing of these false prophets is done without any fear of indictment. Things will reach such a point in Israel that when they have to kill a false prophet, they're not going to worry about the state of Israel coming and arresting them for that. That's how far advanced that we're going to be moved into receiving the Word of God. So let's pick this up then in Zechariah 13 by reading verses 4, 5, and 6. It says, when that day comes, each one of the prophets will be shamed by his vision when he prophesies. He will stop wearing a hair cloak to deceive people. And instead he will say, I'm no prophet. I work the soil. Since my youth, I've only wanted to be an ordinary man. One more lie. Then verse 6 it says, if someone asks him, then what are these gashes between your shoulders? He will answer, I got hurt at my friend's house. Another lie, but hang on to that. We're going to come back to that in a few minutes. This is still talking about these false prophets. We're simply getting a bit more insight here. These false prophets will be professional prophets, in spite of what they're saying here. Professional in the sense that they apparently, up to this point, will have been making their living through being prophets. They will be, however, disclaiming any association at this point with being a prophet. It will be no longer popular to be a prophet. In fact, this kind of a prophet may well be outlawed by the time we get this far in to this end of the age. Any of the symbols of the office of power or cult authority will be done away with. That's going to quit wearing the hair coat. They will no longer make their public revelations, which in content are not only untrue, but as we've looked at, they deceive. They will no longer vest themselves with badges of authority to deceive people into thinking that they're men of God. That would be, again, like the wearing of this hair cloak. Distinctive clothing of a prophet. Garb that would enhance their credibility as a prophet. That's why in certain religions they wear signs of the office, so it enhances their credibility as being prophets. Verse 5 here is showing us that these men really have no scruples. will boldly say, I am not a prophet. But if you notice in this passage, there is no real returning to God here. There is no what in some circles would call repentance being shown whatsoever. They will not be willing to fess up to what they were and turn from it. They will just be willing to hide it. Hide it. Hey, I never made my money that way. I made my money as a farmer. I'm a country bumpkin. What do I know? You know, as we look at that and we look at today, some things never change, do they? If we go back into ancient times to when Ahab and Jezebel led Israel into Baal worship. You know the story. Elijah has challenged the prophets of Baal, and they've been trying to get a fire going on this great, huge pile that they've built so that it will consume their offering to Baal to prove that their God is superior to Elijah's God. Well, let's pick this up in 1 Kings 18, verse 27. Around noon, Elijah began ridiculing them. Shout louder, because there'd been no reaction. See, their false god was supposed to ignite the bonfire. Shout louder, after all, he's a god, isn't he? Maybe he's daydreaming, or maybe he's on the potty, or maybe he's away on a trip. Maybe he's asleep and you have to wake him up. So they shouted louder, and follow this, and slashed themselves with swords and knives as their custom was, until blood gushed out all over them. Now it was afternoon, and they went on ranting and raving until it was time for the evening offering, but no voice came, no one answered, no one paid any attention. Apparently, this slashing is the same sort of thing that will happen with the prophets, the false prophets of Israel in the end of the age, as told us by Zechariah 13, 4 through 6. Give me Zechariah 13, 6 again, please. If someone asks him, that's the false prophet, what are those gashes between your shoulders? He will answer, I got hurt at a friend's house. See, this is the same thing. Trying to get the attention of God, trying to get everybody's attention. What are these gashes on your shoulders? Well, that's an accusation. The Hebrew actually says the wounds are located between the hands. Between the hands, which could mean between the shoulders. It could indicate being even on the chest, but also on the back. Probably between the shoulders on the back. The wounds would be self-inflicted. And this is a common practice today among the Shiite Muslims. This is done in the so-called ecstasy of religious practice. That these future false prophets will have these, will be looked upon at that time as a common practice. If we want to identify one of these false prophets, we'll need to look for the scarring. Again, the false prophets will lie. I got them at a friend's house. Wonder who the friend was. They'll be saying these weren't inflicted during some occult practice. I'm just a farmer. It's interesting that Adonai involves himself in giving this information to us in this kind of detail. We need to assimilate this because we may well need to have this in mind, because we potentially, in the age we live in now, could come across this very thing. Don't know how soon that this will be in place. Now, let's see how we interpret it when we come across it, when we do actually see it. See, we have to have this information. All right, next. Next we're going to look at Zechariah 13:7. Awake, sword, against my shepherd, against the man who is close to me, says Adonai Tzevaot. Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. I will turn my hand against the young ones. There's a lot in this. The shepherd that gets struck here could be talking about Yeshua at his first coming. But Adonai is saying here that the shepherd is a man who is really close to me. See, awake sword against my shepherd, against the man who is close to me. The word actually used here in the Hebrew indicates that the closeness is like that of being a neighbor. Like that of being a neighbor. We find that particular word in Leviticus several times, and there it is an associate or someone who works closely with God. Actually, the word gives the inference of dwelling side by side with God in the work that's going on. Dwelling side by side, again like a neighbor. In other words, the shepherd and Adonai are neighbors, like social equivalents, and I think that's an interesting thought. But the description is that of a shepherd. The shepherd is someone that takes care of the sheep. And here Adonai commands the sword to strike the shepherd, and as a result the sheep will be scattered. And Yeshua, who was the shepherd of his disciples, uses this same phrase in Matthew to describe his disciples and his relationship with them. And the disciples did suffer during his death and at the time after his death. Judas Iscariot hung himself, for example. The other 11 were all murdered except for John. And they were all murdered for the action of bringing the gospel. That is reflected here in, I will turn my hand against the young ones. The young ones are those that follow. In light of the history that we now see very clearly, this fits the events surrounding the disciples, and in fact it fits the events surrounding many leaders over the last, let's say, 2,000 years, particularly in the more modern times when leaders of the body of Messiah all over the world are being subjected to more and more persecution. It's happening in China. China's Christians are hiding like droves now. It's happening in the Sudan and India as examples. It's happening really anywhere that Islam persecution is being prevalent. So as we look further into our study, we're going to see that this persecution is going to even become more intense. Let's look at that quote in Matthew 26, 30 through 32. After singing the Hallel, they went out to the Mount of Olives, and Yeshua then said to them, tonight you will all lose faith in me. As Tanakh says, I will strike the shepherd dead. The shepherd's going to be struck. And the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I have been raised, I will go ahead of you into the Galilee. Note that in quoting this, what we're hearing about is something from Zechariah 17:3. Note that Yeshua does not include here part of the saying of Zechariah 17:3. That part that he has not said is, I will turn my hand against the young ones. He omits this part. He's done this before, made only a partial quote. He's making a partial quote because he's telling them only things about his first coming, and the things he's not quoting are things that will come in his second ministry. In Luke, at the start of his ministry, chapter 4, verses 18 and 19, the Spirit of Adonai is upon me. Therefore he has anointed me to announce good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the imprisoned and renewed sight for the blind, to release those who have been crushed, to proclaim a year of favor of Adonai. Well, I want you to hold this thought, what we've just read up here. Go to Isaiah 61, beginning in verse 1. The Spirit of Adonai Elohim is upon me, because Adonai has anointed me to announce the good news to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom from the captives, to let out into the light those bound in the dark. I will proclaim the year of favor of Adonai. And that's where Yeshua stopped. He didn't proclaim the day of vengeance of God, because the day of vengeance of God was not in his first coming. That will be something that will be coming in his second coming. It's amazing how carefully Yeshua kept everything that is prophesied in the proper bracket. His first coming or his second coming. Wording is a little different. Statement is the same. Yeshua did this at the start of his ministry in the synagogue at Nazareth. And where does he stop? In the middle of verse 2 of Isaiah. He doesn't say, in the day of vengeance of our God, because that's not what he was there for at that time. The day of vengeance of our God is the future event that this prophecy that we're looking at now is all about. It's still a future event. This is the same thing that he did back in Matthew 26, 30 and 31 that we just looked at. He quoted only the things of his first coming. I'm harping on this. He didn't mention turning a hand against the young ones, which is going to be those that are coming in from Israel to a relationship with him for the first time. That third that's going to come in that we're going to look at in a few minutes. We're now approaching the second coming, and the omitted parts of these verses in the Tanakh, not quoted at the first coming, will be brought into action at his future time on earth. I want us also to look at a scripture about the day of vengeance, because that day of vengeance is going to be something that is going to take place as we move into this new era. This is talking about the end times. It's talking about the false Messiah, the little horn. Daniel chapter 7, is it? Verse 25. He will speak words. This is talking about the false Messiah. He will speak words against the Most High and try to exhaust the holy ones of the Most High. He will attempt to alter the seasons and the law, and the holy ones will be handed over to him for a time, times, and a half time. This is going to be during that time, if you will, in the future, when the day of vengeance against Israel is going to come. The day of vengeance against Israel is going to split Israel into two distinct groups, the 2/3 that perish and the 1/3 that will remain. So during this time, during this 3.5 years, there's going to be a great persecution. It's going to be building up to a final time. God is going to turn the world over, I believe, to the false Messiah. Just going to lift his hand away. There is refining and testing. We'll get to that in a minute. That's going to take place. Zechariah 13:7 is just stating this Daniel information in a really different way. Daniel is telling us who Adonai will use against the young ones. Now, Zechariah 13:8 and 9. In that time, throughout that land, says Adonai, 2/3 of those in it will be destroyed. They will die, but 1/3 will remain. That third part I will bring through the fire. I will refine them as silver is refined. I will test them as gold is tested. They will call on my name. I will answer them. I will say, this is my people, and they will say, Adonai is my God. Wow. This is talking about something that's going on in Israel, in that land. In that land, first thing we have to note is that the whole land of Israel is involved. Complete Jewish Bible's translation of that land is really a little ambiguous. This is speaking of Israel. All of Israel is involved in the terrible carnage that's being described here. This is pretty straightforward. 2/3 will be destroyed. They will die. The implication is that this will occur in somewhat of a brief time, possibly even in a single event. The numbers are specific, though. 2/3 will perish, 1/3 will remain. This verse 8 of Zechariah 13 is a slam dunk attention getter. We could spend hours of time here tracing down facets of this that occur all through the prophets. But my question is, what is the shorter story? What is the shorter story? The shorter story really is in time. At some point of the future of this prophecy, and as we look at things building in the Mideast and in the world really, that time appears to be closing in on us. So what is this talking about beyond sheer numbers? What is this talking about beyond sheer numbers? And I want to deal with sheer numbers for just a minute. 2/3 in the land will be destroyed, 1/3 will remain. If this were to happen now, right now, today, there's an estimated 8.5 million people living in Israel. A little over 75% of these are Israelis. That's about 6.5 million, largely calling themselves Jews. If this is addressing only Jews, not the whole population of Israel, just the Jews, then roughly, if we're talking 2/3 perishing, that's 4.3 million people going to be destroyed. Destroyed is the term used here. That would leave 2.2 million people, 2.2 million Israelis left living. And this is talking about numbers. This is talking about sheer numbers. So what is this talking about beyond just the sheer numbers? This is talking about the judgment of Adonai taking place. The sheer numbers make this scary. Sheer numbers make this scary. No one really wants to deal with this. Again, a whole bunch of things come into play with this. First, let's ask how such huge numbers can be in play. 2/3 of Israel destroyed. Scripture lays out pretty clearly that is the Mideast Muslims that are leading this attack on Israel. My guess is that it is a ground war at the initial beginning, even multi-front, because we've got eruptions now that kind of give us a foreview. We've got eruptions going on out of Gaza that have got a lot of the IDF tied up. We've got things going on in the Golan. We've got the people that are in southern Lebanon. This is probably going to be a multi-front war. And I think even though it is a multi-front war, it's going to ultimately end up with it going against the Muslims that are attacking. So the Muslims go to an option that appears that they have through these sheer numbers. They go nuclear. They go nuclear. Just a guess. But I want you to be aware that Iran and North Korea have been in cahoots since 1985. This has been going on between Iran and North Korea since 1985. The short story is Iran has had oil, and the cash that oil generates. North Korea has had weapons, including nukes, but no cash or oil. And being isolated by almost all of the world, North Korea is in a position where they would sell any weapons, including nuclear technology, maybe even a bomb or two, if the price was right, because they had to have cash. They had to be able to lay their hands on money to continue to operate as a state. As an example about how this interaction has worked, Iran's missile technology that they have used and are using against Israel today, the missiles that they're delivering into Syria to be used against Israel, That missile technology came from North Korea. That's where they learned how to do all this. If, big if, the cause of Israel's huge population loss is being from nuke, they will almost certainly retaliate. And that's going to bring the whole world against Israel. If they do retaliate, that would help explain Isaiah 17:1, please. This will soon stop being a city, it will become a heap of ruins, uninhabitable. That's never happened throughout the history of Damascus, right up to and including this afternoon. If, again, if this then goes wider, it'll help explain some things that we'll see as we go through Revelation. But there's more to what's being said here. Zechariah 13:8 and 9, please. In time, throughout that land, says Adonai, 2/3 of those in it will be destroyed. They will die, but 1/3 will remain. That third part I will bring through the fire. I will refine them as silver is refined. I will test them as gold is tested. They will call on my name. Aha. And I will answer them. I will say, this is my people, and they will say, Adonai is my God. Let's take those 2/3 that are destroyed to the parable of weeds. Everybody familiar with Yeshua's parable of the weeds? Matthew 13:24. Yeshua put before them, that's the group gathered in front of him in Israel, his first coming. Yeshua put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field, but while people were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and then went away. And when the wheat sprouted and formed heads of grain, the weeds also appeared. And the owner's servants came to him and said, Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where have the weeds come from? Remember, this is a parable. It's pointing to something we need to understand. Next. He answered, An enemy has done this. The servants asked him, When do you want us to go pull them up? But he said, No, because if you pull up the weeds, you might uproot some of the wheat at the same time, but let them both grow until the harvest. Until the harvest. And at harvest time I will tell the reapers to collect the weeds first and tie them into bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. We just can't read the Bible. We have to read the Bible. What's the connection to what we're looking at? Look a little further ahead in Matthew 13, verse 36. After he left the crowds and went into the house, his Talmudim approached him and said, Explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field. And he answered, The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. As for the good seed, these are the people who belong to the kingdom. The 1/3, if you will. And the weeds are the people who belong to the evil one. The 2/3, if you will. And the enemy who sows them is the adversary. The harvest is the end of the age that we're talking about, that we're looking at prophecies about. And the harvesters are the angels next. Just as the weeds are collected and burned up in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send forth his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom all the things that cause people to sin, and all the people who are far from Torah. That's the 2/3 of Israel that we're talking about back in Zechariah. And they will throw them into the fiery furnace, where people will wail and grind their teeth. Then the righteous will shine forth like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Whoever has ears, let him hear. Wow. Again, we can't just read the Bible. We have to read the Bible. This is pointing to, again, the prophecy of Zechariah 13:8 and 9. In verse 9 of that prophecy, Yeshua says he's going to bring that 1/3 of them through the fire. Through the fire. They will be survivors of this war. Perhaps this war having gone nuclear. Why this 1/3? Well, there's a clue in verse 9 that we've been looking at, they will have been tested and refined. They will have been tested and refined. In this context, refined indicates there is nothing left in them that diminishes their purity towards their refiner. They will call on his name. Whose name must be called on at this time for them to achieve the status of being claimed by Adonai as being his people? That name has to be Yeshua, because there is no other name that can be called on that can bring you into a relationship with the full God. That's the name that will get them through the fire. Calling on the name of Yeshua points also to something else that will go down at this same time. That calling on the name of Yeshua, that could very well be talking about the call that must go out from Jerusalem before Yeshua can return as King of Kings. Give me Matthew 23:37, please. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you kill the prophets, you stone those who are sent to you. How often have I wanted to gather your children just as a hen gathers her chickens under her wings, but you refused. Look, God is abandoning your house to you, leaving it desolate. And verse 39, for I tell you, from now on, you will not see me again, that's Yeshua, until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Until you call out for me to return. And they will call out his name. Let's go to Ezekiel chapter 11, verse 16. Therefore say that Adonai Elohim says this, true, I removed them far away from the nations and scattered them among the countries. Nevertheless, I've been a little sanctuary for them in the countries to which they have gone. Therefore, says Adonai Elohim, I will gather you from the peoples and collect you from the countries where you've been scattered, and I will give the land of Israel to you. Do you realize that's a capsule of the last 2,000 years? Right there. A capsule prophecy. I'm going to scatter you all over the world, but I'm going to be available for you, and I'm going to bring you back to Israel and give you the land. Wow. Next. Then they will go there and remove, that's back to Israel. Then they will go there and remove all its loathsome things and disgusting practices. Who's this talking about? This is talking about that third, that righteous remnant, ultimately. Verse 19, and I will give them unity of heart. I will put a new spirit among you. I will remove from their bodies hearts of stone and give them hearts of flesh, so that they will live by my regulations, obey my rulings, and act by them. In other words, they'll be keeping Torah. Then they will be my people, and I will be their God. They can call out. And he will say, yes, you are my people. But as for those whose hearts go after the heart of their loathsome things, we're talking the 2/3 now, and disgusting practices, I will bring the consequences of their ways on their own heads, says Adonai Elohim. At verse 19 says, I will put a new spirit among you. Starts at the end of the 3rd line, I will put a new spirit among you. That's what we're looking at, really, at what's going on in Zechariah 13, 8 and 9. Removing the hearts of stone and giving hearts of flesh. Remember, this is mourning and lamentation of the people when they see whom they have pierced. This is going to be a process. We'll find out about this as we continue. But this is going to be a process. It isn't going to happen instantly one morning. The people are not going to see just one event or one something and suddenly they'll all change. This is going to be an ongoing process. The human heart doesn't, in most cases, change that quickly. This verse 21 here, though, at the end of that passage, really explains the two-thirds that are lost. But as for those whose hearts go after the heart of their loathsome things and disgusting practices, we've just discussed the loathsome things in Zechariah 13, verses 2 and 3. I will bring the consequences of their ways on their heads, says Adonai Elohim. So, the question always arises, why would God cause two-thirds of his people to perish? We have to remember that Israel today, the modern state of Israel today, is a pagan nation. We have to remember that. They are no better than any of the other nations of the world, and they follow all of the disgusting practices of the rest of the nations of the world. God will not tolerate that in his people. He's going to purify his people Israel. Let me quote you something from Haaretz, which is an Israeli newspaper. This is from 7 years ago. It's from Wednesday, July 4th, 2001. Quote, a storm erupted in the Knesset Committee on the Status of Women yesterday. Was discussed the emotionally charged issue of abortion. The pretext for the discussion was a video cassette distributed to some 350 Israeli households by a non-profit organization which encourages women not to abort. The distribution of that video cassette caused a storm to erupt in Knesset. That is how far off course Israel was 17 years ago. They haven't gained any ground that they would have this thing. The point is, Israel is a secular state, a pagan state that follows the practices of the rest of the world. The objection to the cassette was that the public should not be shown such frightening pictures as a fetus in the womb being aborted. If we look back at that year, there were 19,300 legal abortions in Israel that year. God is saying here in Ezekiel 11:21, I will bring the consequences of their ways upon their own heads. I will bring the consequences of their ways upon their own heads. Yeah, certainly those that turn to God and turn from their sins, he's going to forgive. Apparently, though, two-thirds of the population isn't going to want to do this. They're going to want to hang on to their pagan ways, but at this time coming in history, our God is going to have reached a point where he's had it. That attitude isn't going to be tolerated anymore. So then look at what happens to the remaining third, to that remnant. Yeah, they're going to be put through the fire. They're going to be put through this terrible war. But this fire is not a destructive element for them, but rather it's an instrument of cleansing. And it appears that they will come from the furnace of affliction, this war, to a renewed covenant. It appears they will come from the furnace of affliction experience that they're going to go through to a renewed covenant relationship with God, not just merely seeing him as the one whom they have pierced, but seeing him as the one that they need to be in this different relationship with, making their relationship with Adonai at an altogether different level than it's ever been. The metaphor used of a smelting furnace burning out impurities is fairly common. Smelting furnace wasn't used. It just said, I'm going to clean them up like I'm refining gold and silver. That's done in a smelting furnace. As in the furnace, impurities are removed from expensive metals to produce the pure form, so will the testing of the remnant produce a pure heart. Then God will say, they are my people, and the people will finally be in the spiritual condition to know, intellectually determine, that Adonai is their God. Not just emotionally determine this, but intellectually determine Adonai is our God. It's interesting that the last 4 lines of Zechariah 9 have a poetic structure. It's that inverted form that we often see, and it begins they, then it says I, and then they. As it reads, it says, they will call on my name, and I will answer them. And I will say, this is my people. And they will say, Adonai is my God. They, they. That reflects what is pointed to in Malachi 3, 6, and 7, please. Because I, Adonai, do not change. You sons of Jacob are not to be destroyed. Since the days of your forefathers, you have turned from my laws, my Torah, and have not kept them. Return to me, and I will return to you. That's what God is all about. If we will simply return to Him, like that third turns to Him, turns to Yeshua, then He will return to them, says Adonai Tzavaot. But you ask, it's like those 2/3 are asking this question, but you ask, in respect to what are we supposed to return? 2 distinct different groups, 2 distinct mindsets. There are 2 sides to any relationship, even when it's between God and man. See, there can't be a relationship if there's only one participant. Evidently, the people of Israel have to be brought through the furnace of affliction, that smelting furnace, to arrive at this relationship that they're going to come to. All right. Zechariah 14:1, please. Look, a day is coming for Adonai when your plunder, Jerusalem, will be divided right there within you. That's another attention getter, isn't it? Again, a day of Adonai is coming. This is actually a very accurate translation. A day is coming for Adonai. Look, a day is coming for Adonai. This is the time immediately before Messiah's return. And it's covered from the perspective of what occurs in and about Jerusalem. This introduction, again, the way it's set up is important. The focus is on Adonai, not on the day. A day is coming for Adonai, not Adonai's day is coming. Subtle difference, but important. Some people consider this more of a threat, really, than a promise, but I don't see that. Because here we see Jerusalem is defeated. So that's looked upon by many as a threat. The inhabitants helplessly watch as what is theirs is divided amongst the enemy troops. The language here makes it very personal. Let's move on. Zechariah 14:2. For I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem for war. Well, that's another attention getter, isn't it? I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem for war. The city will be taken, the houses will be rifled, the women will be raped, and half the city will go into exile, but the rest of the people will not be cut off from the city. That's not a very pretty picture. All of those that are moving to Jerusalem to await the return of Messiah should pause and maybe read this. Ain't going to be a pleasant place to be when just before he comes back. What we see here is that God is the instrument that causes this to happen. All of the nations of the world will be brought against Jerusalem to fight it. Historically, when has God done this sort of thing to Jerusalem? Each time Jerusalem has become apostate. He's gone in and cleaned house. Babylon, cleaned house. Rome, cleaned house. We're coming up on a 3rd time of Israel becoming apostate, and God sickened the world on them. I could spend a lot of time giving modern examples about this. I'm going to limit it to three major ones. Number one, we talked about this a little earlier. 80% of the Jewish population of Israel is secular. Any belief in God is cursory, religious practice virtually non-existent. Give you an idea, once on a tour when we were over there, we were let into the synagogue at En Gev, a kibbutz on the Kinneret, on the southeast side of the Sea of Galilee. We were let into this synagogue, and it was a beautiful place. I can't tell you how fantastic that was. It was classic. It was classic. They must have had, I'm guessing, 8 or 9 Torah scrolls in there. But that synagogue is never used unless they rent it out for some reason, because it's a secular kibbutz. And unless they're letting somebody in there for a special purpose, like us to see it, or somebody renting it for a wedding or something, it stays locked. Locked. Padlocked the rest of the time, so you can't get into it. Number two, the 20% that consider themselves religious are largely under a leadership that is corrupt. A number of the Orthodox Jewish leaders today are in prison for corruption of various reasons. The believing Messianic Jewish community isn't that big. It's not much more than the 7,000 that God spoke of through Elijah. Actual numbers probably between 15 and 20,000 Messianic Jews in Israel today. Openly. How many closet believers? I got no clue. Number three. Here's one example of the kind of thinking that runs the country Israel. And it haunts me. When the Temple Mount was retaken in the 1967 war against the Muslim countries, first time back in Jewish hands since 70 Common Era, first time back in Jewish hands in over 1900 years, all they had to do was throw up a temple and begin temple worship of their God on that temple. What did they do? Remember now, this was back in their hands as a sovereign move of God, because there was no way that the Israeli army of that era could have stood against all of the armies coming in from the Islamic countries. Iraq had the 4th strongest army in the world of that era. We'll get into that again in a minute. What did they do? Well, they immediately gave the Temple Mount back to the people who were worshiping and continue to worship their false god on it. The Temple Mount, to the government of Israel at that time, was no more than a pawn in man's attempt to create peace for himself. Jerusalem and Israel qualify as apostate. And God says he will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to make war against it. Now, that seems like an unlikely statement. All the nations of the world will come against Jerusalem. But do you know, we had something of this nature that we were involved in that happened just not that long ago. Think back to Desert Storm, 1990. Coalition of nations, very powerful nations, came against a single nation, Iraq. They came against Iraq because Iraq wasn't playing the way that they wanted it to. And that's why that the world is going to be brought against Jerusalem, because Jerusalem isn't playing the way that they should. Iraq, at that time, again, was considered to be the 4th strongest military in the world. That's a position that we could put onto Israel right now today. But back in those days, that coalition of the world powers that came against Iraq, they stood no chance. That's what's going to happen with Israel when the world comes against them this next time. Iraq was tough, man. They'd been at war with Iran for 5 years. They had a battle-hardened elite guard. Here Adonai says that all the nations of the earth are coming against Israel, representing by Jerusalem. Why? Well, if we think about this, why, we have to ask about what's really the reason. Certainly material wealth is not the reason for conquest. We've looked at that. There's not enough wealth in Jerusalem to cover the cost of all the nations of the world's armies, much less for there to be any kind of a profit involved. But apparently all the nations will be involved. Adonai says so. The reason for involvement will be more ideological than anything else. That's an interesting word, ideological. Certainly, there's going to be a military campaign, but still the only explanation for the world wanting to get involved in this is ideology. There are a lot of scenarios that we could present. There's been a lot of scenarios presented about this. But them coming against Jerusalem really flies in the face of world order. What will be the outcome of this? It's a move that will bring the false Messiah into Jerusalem. Again, it would appear that what brings the world against Jerusalem is ideological. And an ideological problem seems the only reason why the world would come against Jerusalem. Nevertheless, with the whole world involved, the expected will happen. An overwhelming superior force will come against the city, Jerusalem. All of Israel will be conquered. And what has happened will happen again. What's happened in wars over and over again will happen again. The city will be looted, pillaged, rapes take place, people exiled. Israel is going to be whacked. Zechariah 14:3. Then Adonai will go out and fight against those nations, fighting as on the day of battle. That's pretty straightforward sounding. Judgment and corruption will have been brought against Jerusalem. When that's completed, Adonai will step in against those that brought this, no doubt using the 1/3 left that we've been looking at, the righteous remnant that is involved. Obadiah actually speaks to this. It says, beginning in verse 15, "For the day of Adonai is near for all nations." Speaking of all nations, it says, "As you did, it will be done to you." That's God going out and fighting against the nations. Your dealings will come back on your head. Then it tells why. "For just as you have drunk on my holy mountain," come against Jerusalem, "so will all the nations drink in turn," because God, Adonai, is going to go out and fight against those nations. Yes, they, the nations, will drink and gulp it down and be as if they never existed. But on Mount Zion, that's the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, a holy remnant who will escape, this is the 1/3, and the house of Jacob will possess. See, on Mount Zion there will be a holy remnant who will escape, and the house of Jacob will repossess their rightful inheritance. Then it says, the house of Jacob will be a fire, the house of Joseph a flame. This is talking about all of Israel. Setting a flame and consuming the stubble, which is the house of Esau. None of the house of Esau will remain, for Adonai has spoken. The house of Esau is the modern-day Arabs, who will be the main force that will be involved in taking Israel and Jerusalem. That's Zechariah 14:3. Then Adonai will go out and fight against those nations, fighting is on the day of battle. It's really somewhat ambiguous in that this word against can be used in so many different ways and is used 3 different ways in our study here. This word against in the Hebrew is in the form of a prefix. The prefix is beit. The word it is prefixing is goyim. Adonai will go out and fight against those nations. Fighting is on the day of eternity. Against those nations. But why is this ambiguous? Well, this is ambiguous, quite honestly, because this letter in the Hebrew really is making up a preposition. For those of you who like to study the language, making up a preposition. This Hebrew preposition in combination with the word fight usually means against. But this beit here translated against normally in Hebrew would be translated in. In the goyim, not against the goyim. But if that was translated that way, we would have a situation where Adonai would be fighting with the nations instead of against them. That's the fun of translating. To complicate this even further, this same construction will occur again in Zechariah 14:14, where it is translated, Yehuda too will fight against Jerusalem, and the wealth of all the nations will be assembled. Judah too will fight against Jerusalem. That same prefix in front of Jerusalem. But if we have that translation, then we have Judah fighting with the nations against Jerusalem. That then should be translated according to context in. Judah too will be fighting in Jerusalem against the nations. It ain't easy, is it? We looked at a situation earlier whereby we had this same kind of a complication. I want to talk to you about the fact that as we go through these things and look at these things, we have to be extremely careful and fall back on the context of Scripture, context of the whole Bible. What's the context of the whole Bible telling us about all this? See, God is not going to be fighting in or with the nations, but against them. If you take that same bit there, and again, according to context, it can mean in, at, on, among, with, towards, according to, by, because of, before, or against. Just to name a few. So we have to then come back to what is the context of what's going on here. We've cleaned house on Israel. Now God has gone out to fight against those that have cleaned house on Israel, and he has as an ally to work with him those who accepted him and his Messiah, the righteous remnant involved in this. Because Adonai is going to go out and do battle against these nations. The fighting as on a day of battle. Implied here is fighting in the same way he did at the Red Sea crossing. Give me Exodus 14, please. Moses answered the people, "Stop being fearful, remain steady, and you will see how Adonai is going to save you. He will do it today. Today you've seen the Egyptians, but you will never see them again. Adonai will do battle for you. Just calm yourselves down." Israel here, as they were just out of Egypt, was a ragtag bunch. Yeah, there were millions of them. but they had no military training at all. They'd been slaves. They had slave mentality. The most competent army on the earth was coming after them. See the parallel? Egypt was the world power. Israel was sandwiched between them and the sea, no escape. And Adonai came and fought for them. Israel is sandwiched right now between the world powers led by the Muslim Arabs and the sea. And Adonai is going to use them to bring his judgment, clean house in Israel. But the situation coming is that we've looked like at in Zechariah 14:3. Israel will find themselves in a position of no escape, and Adonai will come and fight for them. Our time's up. We'll pick this up again in Zechariah 14:4 next week.